So, what is your thoughts about this, about neoliberal feminism? Because you did mention about how it's more about, instead of equalizing or stressing equality, but stressing power, these power dynamics and getting more power. What do you think about the idea that neoliberal feminism isn't exactly feminism, but telling feminists that they actually have to mimic men and male dominant culture?
I am so with you on that. I think that absolutely, represents so well these important points. So absolutely. And in fact, when I write about this, and I have a section at the end where I say, don't call this feminism, stop this. This is not feminism. And I have places in the paper where I put feminism in quotes, and that is deliberate because it's exactly as you have said so beautifully. For me, is it feminism? I mean, call it power then, call it whiteness, call it aligning yourself with white supremacist systems. But yes, is it just trying to align with how doing things that have rewarded men and reproducing that? That's not feminism for me. And I think that it is an insult to call this feminism. It really is. It's a useful conceptual concept, I think, because it's kind of trying to confront people when they say, I can't wait for Clinton to be president. It's going to be a feminist triumph. And that is the point at which I say, excuse me, in your world, maybe this is neoliberal feminism. It's a feminist triumph according to neoliberal systems. But it is not a feminist triumph in the way that I understand and experience and practice feminism. And so sadly, you do see, I can give you an example. You see examples of in organizations where people will host events, like a group of senior women will host events like, how as a feminist to achieve power and this and that and all the other thing. And there's a sliding from what feminism is supposed to be about, at least the way I understand it, to individualized power that, as you say, is a reproduction of power where the masculine behaviors get rewarded, basically. So yes. And the reason why we still talk in some circles about neoliberal feminism, but feminism in quotes, which is deliberate in the paper. Every time I refer to neoliberal feminism, the feminism is in quotes, saying, basically questioning the whole concept. And I think it is important to still use that phrase just to show, or try to show, this is what people are calling feminism. But this neoliberal, in my view, is really what it's all about.
Well, I just think that this is so interesting because sometimes you'll see self-described feminists really kind of attack or take issue with women who want to be stay-at-home mothers because they're not in the workforce. Although, it's arguably, it could be argued that parenthood is quite a job, right?
Absolutely.
And so you see a lot of self-described feminists at times attacking these women for being stay-at-home mothers, even though, again, they wanted to do that. That was the choice that they wanted to make, to take care of themselves and their family. And so I just think that this is kind of very, very, there's a relationship here between that and that, because if you say that feminism should mimic male-dominated culture, then there isn't room for women that want to be stay-at-home mothers.
Absolutely. And also I think, and yes, and I think that way of thinking is an operation of neoliberal quote-unquote feminism, because in a neoliberalized agenda, your worth is measured by what you contribute to, the organization in order to be able to make it more successful. So if you're a stay-at-home parent and you're not part of being so-called economically productive, so that makes sense that the neoliberal feminists will go after that. They will attack that because you're not upholding this neoliberal ideal of being so-called contributing to economic growth or whatever the case is. And it's really interesting. I have some colleagues who are very active in doing research on working experiences. What they argue is that, can you imagine if you paid women's work, as stay-at-home parents, if that work were paid, it's unpaid work. That's one way of looking at it. It's working all the time. It's caretaking, it's managing the household, doing innumerable amounts of things. So it is work. It's unpaid work. But it is definitely work. Now, maybe some women don't want to think of it as work, and that's a whole other debate. But there's this idea that, if somebody is going to the organization to be economically productive, there are a whole lot of energy and effort behind that that's making that possible. Somebody's taking the household and not being paid for their work. Somebody's taking care of the children. And this is one of the ways that I think neoliberal feminism can actually harm women and men. So men who might quite like to enact their more feminine side, or men who would be so keen to be the caretaker, to be the full-time parent, may face a lot of struggle doing that from society, or, in terms of these kinds of assumptions that now you're a man staying at home. Oh my gosh, what's that all about? Yeah, so that raises some additional issues, but definitely, yeah. I agree. It's so true. It's part of that.
Well, this is kind of out of the purview of your article, but very related, or has a relationship to what you just mentioned. Are you familiar with trans-exclusionary radical feminism, by any chance?
TERFs. Yes. They call them TERFs. Yes.
So where do you think this fits in with this narrative of neoliberal feminism?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know if that can be, it is a violent form of feminism. It is exclusionary. I have, both personally and also experiences that I follow, know of people who suffer from the violent exclusion of that form of feminism. And whether it can be explained partly in terms of neoliberal feminism, in one sense, here's how I can make a connection with that. So there is a part in my paper where I say that one of the ways that neoliberalism thrives is by upholding this gender binary. This idea that women are this and they have these bodies, and women and men are this and they have these bodies, and oh, she's a woman, therefore it's a feminist achievement. Oh, he's a man, therefore he can't possibly be a feminist. So neoliberalism thrives on gender binaries, because once you start to have nuance about what it means to be a man or a woman, that creates a lot of complications for the neoliberal system, which I argue thrives on gender binaries. So when you have people who are non-binary, who are gender fluid, who are trans women, and they are challenging this gender binary, then I think it probably is the case that neoliberal feminism is part of this operation of TERF mindset. And there might be some work on that, but I'm not. I have to think about that more, actually. What do you think about it? I hope that makes some sense.
No, I think that makes great sense, because I didn't even think about neoliberalism feminism really thriving or upholding these binary gender roles and gender types, right? Not necessarily roles, because they want more women in power.
Yeah.
But it's really kind of to favor this idea or concept of what is power as well. Well, it's male-dominated power that women should therefore try to achieve, but still be feminine in the process of trying to achieve that power. And just for our viewers, just in case you don't know what TERF is, I have the definition here. It's an acronym for trans-exclusionary radical feminism. Sometimes exclusionary is expanded as eliminationist or exterminationist, instead to more accurately convey the degree in which TERFs advocate for harm towards trans people, specifically trans people who were assigned male at birth. So that's just for our viewers who aren't really familiar with this, because I didn't know what it was until last year, honestly.
I think it's I think it's within the last year or so it's become an acronym on social media. I mean the behaviors have been there, but I think that acronym, I think that's relatively new, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, and the thing about the gender binary that I argue is important is because if we look at this very strange response to, for example, Bernie Sanders comes along, and it can be a whole debate how people feel about Sanders, and that's something separate. But Sanders comes along, and he has this feminist voting record, and he has this passion for working class and things that would seem more so-called, more kind of an inclusion aspect of feminist. Contrasted with Clinton, who, if we listen to people of color, has a much different record. In terms of LGBT history, in terms of, going beyond white feminism or not. So it's really interesting that, anything that Bernie Sanders would have done for people who already adopt neoliberal feminism was so easily dismissed. He's a man, he's a white man, just denying his record or saying, he's useless for feminism or whatever. But Hillary Clinton is a woman, and therefore she's a perfect feminist. What in the world is this? But if you think about gender binaries, then I thought this could be a useful concept because to dismiss a man as feminist was convenient then, because here was somebody who was arguably more along the lines of intersectional feminism. Again, people may have various views about Sanders, and that's something separate. But in terms of the specific context of the U.S. election, you have somebody come along who seemed a lot more inclusive, but he was dismissed. So this idea that, this binary that you have, that men are associated with certain things and women are associated with certain things, and there's no nuance for it, and that's something that connects to upholding systems of power, at least in the way I'm starting to think through it at the moment.
Well, I think that it does go into this kind of binaryism with the gender roles and kind of, these barriers. Like, men cannot cross a certain barrier, but women are sometimes allowed to cross that barrier. So if men advocate for something like the freedom to choose, if they're pro-choice, like Bernie Sanders is pro-choice, that gets thrown away, right? Especially if you have a white female that you assume would be pro-choice, but there's nothing that she said was indicative of that. In fact, she chose as her vice presidential nominee ardent proponent of pro-choice. He was not pro-choice at all.
Absolutely.
And so it was, again, leading to that, or giving credence to that contradiction of, well, what is feminism for neoliberals or neoliberal feminism? And it was very contradictory to me to sit back and go wait a minute. You have somebody that's on the record for continually wanting to fund Planned Parenthood and continually has said, on the record, I am pro-choice. And then you had the opposite of that with you can't, it's kind of like dressing up, you're dressing up feminism. But it's really not. It's not something that I would argue was feminism on the Hillary Clinton camp side at all. In fact, I saw it as more dangerous. It's kind of as Barack Obama. Barack Obama, a lot of people thought that he would, help blacks and the black community. Well, blacks lost the majority of their wealth underneath his presidency. And, you saw an increase in violence against black people. Yeah. With the whole police state, that, he would sometimes give lip service towards or to, but then wouldn't really do anything about it. You saw, him wanting to, a lot of blacks have been criminalized for marijuana possession and are currently in federal prison for life for having, minor amounts of marijuana on their person. And this is disproportionately affects the black community, even though whites and blacks carry at the same rates and use at the same rates.
That's right.
And he didn't do anything to make sure that these prisoners were released. He did nothing to make sure that marijuana came off the Schedule I drug criteria. So it just, again, this dressing up of issues, or kind of like just because they are this or they are this, yet not addressing them at all. It's frustrating, to say the least.
It is very frustrating, and that is one of the tragedies that I was. So many people wanted to experience this triumph, that in such a deeply white supremacist history that we could actually manage to elect a Black president. And then, when I started following the example that you gave about marijuana possession, on the international scene, the use of drones, the killing of innocent civilians. One of my friends, who is a European who used to live in Pakistan, she had a much different perspective on Obama. From that perspective. So it is, as you say, it's very discomforting. It's dressing up, and we have to dress it down. I think in conversations like this and all the wonderful activism that all of you do, we need to dress this down and just, and I have also experienced what you mentioned, where you say, I think you said self-professed feminists, right? I actually had that in an earlier version of my paper. So we actually have to go through an editorial review, we get feedback and so on and so forth. But I was banging my head on the desk, people who have worked with deprived communities, even women who advertise themselves as feminists. And like you say, having nominating someone as vice president with a anti-choice agenda, and then Bernie Sanders saying that only one person gets to decide what to do with her body, the woman, in conversation with her doctor if she wants, advice or whatever. So just thinking, which one sounds more feminist to you? So that's where I think the operation of these wider agendas that we don't necessarily realize how much maybe we've invested in. I mean, again, by we, I'm not meaning us, but I'm meaning, how people might invest in these kind of neoliberal agendas, and that we might invest in them for whatever reasons. They give us privileges, or they offer us certain benefits, or they provide a convenient way of seeing the world where, I can celebrate somebody, whatever she's done, because she's a woman, and hooray. And I still have my privileges, and I'm still a privileged person, and hooray. No, it's not working like that for most people. So there needs to be a dressing down, definitely.
Okay, so this is going to be my last question for you.
Sure.
So one thing that I've noticed, and maybe this is something that not a lot of people have noticed, is that there is this, again, Clinton supporters, ardent Clinton supporters, still Clinton supporters will basically point towards to try to fault progressives or, socialists or anything like that for the loss of Hillary Clinton, and specifically their target. So outside of Senator Sanders, they tend to target his wife, Nina Turner, Alejandra Ocasio-Cortez, Susan Sarandon, Rosario Dawson, all of whom are either different races, the majority of whom are female, and yet their argument is, well, it's their fault because they didn't support the most feminist woman candidate in history. I don't know if you've noticed that, but why do you think that there is such a kind of a hate towards actual women? It seems like that supported Senator Sanders, or at least supported and currently do support some of the things that he tries to push.
I think that might be a manifestation of, for the first time in some ways, because we are going through this period of the first attempted nomination and failed election. It's so much easier for people to deal with anxieties or threats to their understanding of privilege by targeting the ones who represent the ideals that they actually should be upholding. It's so much harder to look within, and this is one of the things that I think is an ultimate tragedy, is the complicity that has brought us here. The complicity is not the hardworking people who care about the suffering, which is people like Nina Turner. The complicity is such people who have not been able to confront their privilege. If you're reacting with hatred towards people who have for decades been struggling for the underprivileged, people who experience racism, people who experience illness and cannot afford health care, if these are the people that you're going after, I think you really need to start to think about where your beliefs really lie and where your professed feminism really lies. Because, it's really trying to direct, it's so much easier to direct things outward or to find something out there that, oh, if only Susan Sarandon hadn't tweeted this, Clinton would be president. Or, really, really absurd things happening on Twitter. Like, if Clinton would have been president now, I wouldn't have to be worrying about these tragedies happen. Good morning, where have you been? We're having tragedies now, but these are not tragedies that are new. In other words, that it's really as if they are not wanting to see, it's the ultimate expression of white privilege. If Hillary Clinton were president now, we wouldn't have to worry about things. How more white privilege can we get than that? I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling right now, but how much more white privilege can you get from that? So clearly, you have not, either been involved in or bothered to observe or bothered to learn about immigration detention that's been happening for a long time. Yes, we have to talk about these. These are tragedies now, but please don't pretend like everything would be peach and roses if Clinton was on right now. In fact, I think it's really fascinating how what we're going through now somehow has surfaced things in ways that have not come out before. And, to rather than, to blame other things or to go after other progressives or people who are, oftentimes behind the scenes fighting for people's lives, people's dignity, people's well-being, people's mental and emotional health, all of these things, to go after those people really speaks to something about the comfort in the lives that people have lived, the privileges that people have had.
I think that this kind of manifests very well when you hear people or see people even comment on social media, well, if Clinton had won, I'd be at brunch right now instead of at some protest.
It's absolutely incredible. So apparently things were fine before, and if Clinton would have won, police violence, I don't have to look at that or think about that. Mass incarceration, not a problem for me. Poverty, not a problem for me. People who are dying because they can't afford their health care. Oh yeah, I'm going to go out to brunch. Well, please just wear a shirt that says, here's my white privilege. I'm sorry if I'm getting really upset now, but this is how I react to those kinds of things.
No, it's infuriating because it's like, where were you? Where were you during Obama's presidency or during the Bush years or any type of anywhere? Where were you before?
Yes.
It's infuriating because you're thinking, you do realize that Obama deported so many people of black people and Hispanics or Latinas or Latinos. I mean, he deported more people than Bush did, and then to just point at Donald Trump for him being like the deportation and man in chief, it's ridiculous because you're like, well, where were you before? Were you really just that dumb or just not paying attention? Do you really think that Trump just popped up out of nowhere? People are justifiably angry. People are sick. He was the only one that was saying, I'm going to end these wars, which was a huge attraction of Obama when he said that. And so people are like, we're spending so much money on these things instead of helping our communities. We're losing a lot and things like that. And to explain Trump as like this weird anomaly that just came out of nowhere and blindsided everybody is just ignorant, and it is a very privileged life that they obviously led prior to Trump.
Yes, absolutely. I think that smacks of privilege. I think it specifically smacks of white privilege, and which includes white people. But I also think that might include people who have, in various ways, maybe because of class privilege, they've benefited from white systems, or whatever the case is. It's a real tragedy about Obama, because I think a lot of people, in various ways, really wanted to feel like, oh my goodness, the U.S. has actually twice elected, a black president, and they've actually defeated white supremacy because they've done that. And the tragedy is, as you've said, all the examples that you've given, all the deportations, this has not come out of anywhere. And even longer standing than that, I think it was. I think Sean King posted an article where he was saying that, yes, be outraged, but the idea about America separating parents and children, what's that about? We have a historical legacy with slavery, So it is, and I think we're in a very interesting time, as difficult as it is, and distressing as it is, where I think a lot of the old, I don't know what the word is, all the old familiar narratives, or all the old familiar ways of understanding the world are falling apart, I think. In the sense that I think we need to, again, we meaning society, needs to collectively confront these things. I mean, when somebody posts on Twitter, oh, my life would be so easy, which is different from people who are saying things like, I was living a very easy life and I wasn't aware. The last 2 years, almost 2 years, have opened my mind, and so now I'm protesting. That's very different from, somebody is admitting that they didn't know, that they were privileged, and that they were, very comfortably in their own world, and they've kind of woken up, which is very different from somebody saying that, oh, I could be at brunch right now, but oh, I have to go to a protest. And it's like, well, thank you for advertising publicly and internationally that your privilege and ignorance must be confronted, and going after in hateful ways with people who are enacting, for me, intersectional feminism. So if we want to use that word, who are saying that, oh, these women have been suffering, these women have been experiencing police violence. These, undocumented migrants, this is not something new that's been happening, and actually wanting to make a change, rather than, really, really silly things like people vilifying Susan Sarandon for protesting at an ICE. What is that about? How dare you stand up for people's rights? So you can see how these really, like you say, infuriating, which it is, discourses are circulating, and when it happens by women who are voicing these kinds of things, that's when I say, we need to talk about this white feminism. We need to talk about privilege. We just need to confront this. And I think it's hard, but I think we are at a very interesting moment where a lot more things can be challenged, where as much as people want to dominate one narrative, for every narrative that goes after Nina Turner, or every tweet, there's another tweet about how, her activism inspired them, how they feel hope because of what she has done. And if people want to persist in not thinking about their privilege, I would like to think that they're going to be, that's just not sustainable. If we want to live as communities where everyone benefits, this is just not sustainable and has to be challenged.
Well, that's the thing about neoliberalism, is that it's not about a community. It's about the individual. Absolutely.
Yes.
And I just think that, I keep on mentioning a term of corrosive individualism. And this is just an example of that, because we do need each other. That's how we developed as human beings in societies. Yes. That's why we can actually speak to each other. That's why we can emote. It's because of the fact that we are social beings. But this neoliberalism breaks that down. Arguably, capitalism breaks that bond that we have down, to do something that we actually aren't accustomed to doing. And it promotes unhealthy behavior. It promotes this psychopathy because we kind of glorify people that are willing to, as you mentioned earlier, get into a position of power at the expense of others, which is not behavior that any society that wants to sustain and retain itself should be promoting by any stretch of the means. But yeah, that's what I have about that.
I love this corrosive individualism. I think that represents exactly. It's corrosive. It's not part of who we are as relational social beings, and it's not part of who we should want to be as human beings in the world.
We just finished talking with Etta, and she wrote an article, White Fantasy, White Betrayal, on Neoliberal Feminism in the U.S. presidential election process. So Etta, thank you again for joining us and talking to us about your piece. It's very well written, and we will have no problem. We will have a link in the description below so that you can check it out. Again, Etta, thank you very much for being here.
Yes, and thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
You just listened to part 2 of Actified Chat's discussion with Etta Eulis on feminism. You can find the link for part 1 in the description below in case you missed it. Also, if you haven't done so, please subscribe, like, and share, and head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/ActifiedChat and help support us so we can continue to bring you more content like this. And as always, keep up the good fight, my friends.